Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, Chapter 21. The next morning Mr. Collins was also in the state of angry pride. After breakfast, the girls walked to Meryton to inquire if Mr. Wickham returned. He joined them on their entering the town. "I found," said he, "that I had better not meet Mr. Darcy." Elizabeth highly approved his forbearance, and they talked a lot. Soon after their return, a letter was delivered to Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield. The envelope contained a sheet of elegant little paper. Elizabeth saw her sister's face change as she read it. Said Jane, "This is from Caroline Bingley. The whole party have left Netherfield by this time, and are on their way to town, and without any intention of coming back again." Elizabeth saw nothing in it really to lament. "It is unlucky," said she, after a short pause, "that you should not be able to see your friends before they leave the country. Caroline decidedly says that nobody will return into Hertfordshire this winter. I will read it to you. It is evident that her brother comes back no more this winter. What do you think so? He is in his own master." "What do you think of this, my dear Lizzie?" said Jane. "Is it not clear enough? Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you, and wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She follows him to town in hope of keeping him there, and tries to persuade you that he does not care about you." Jane shook her head. "Indeed, Jane, you ought to believe me. Miss Bingley, I am sure, is more anxious to get Miss Darcy for her brother. But if he returns no more this winter, a thousand things may arise in 6 months." Chapter 22. The Bennets were engaged to dine with the Lucases again. Was Miss Lucas so kind as to listen to Mr. Collins? Elizabeth took an opportunity of thanking her. Charlotte's kindness extended farther than Elizabeth could imagine. Next morning Mr. Collins hastened to Charlotte to throw himself at her feet. In as short a time as Mr. Collins's long speeches would allow, everything was settled between them to the satisfaction of both, and as they entered the house he earnestly asked her to name the day that would make him the happiest of men. But Miss Lucas, who accepted him from the poor desire and establishment, cared not how soon that establishment would happen. Mr. Collins's present circumstances made it a most eligible match for her, to whom they could give little fortune. The whole family was overjoyed on the occasion. The boys and the girls were relieved. Charlotte would not die an old maid. Charlotte herself was tolerably composed. Mr. Collins, to be sure, was neither sensible nor agreeable. His society was irksome, and his attachment to her must be imaginary. But still he would be her husband, and marriage in general was the only provision for well-educated young women of small fortune. When Elizabeth learned about Charlotte's marriage, she could not help crying out, "Engaged to Mr. Collins! My dear Charlotte, impossible!" "Why should you be surprised, my dear Eliza? I see what you are feeling," replied Charlotte. "You must be surprised, very much surprised. So lately as Mr. Collins was washing to you. But when you have had time to think it over, I hope you will be satisfied with what I have done. I am not romantic, you know. I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, considering Mr. Collins' character, connection, and situation in life. I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." Elizabeth quietly answered, "Undoubtedly." And after an awkward pause, they returned to the rest of the family. Charlotte did not stay much longer, and Elizabeth was then left to reflect on what she had heard. Charlotte, the wife of Mr. Collins, was a most humiliating picture. Chapter 23. Elizabeth was sitting with her mother and sisters, reflecting on what she had heard, when Sir William Lucas himself appeared, sent by his daughter, to announce her engagement to the family. Elizabeth mentioned her prior knowledge of it from Charlotte himself, and endeavored to put a stop to the exclamations of her mother and sister by the earnestness of her congratulations to Sir William. Mr. Bennet's emotions were much more tranquil on the occasion. He discovered that Charlotte Lucas, whom he had been used to think tolerably sensible, was as foolish as his wife, and more foolish than his daughter. Between Elizabeth and Charlotte there was a restraint which kept them mutually silent on the subject, and Elizabeth felt that no real confidence could never subsist between them again. Her disappointment in Charlotte made her return to her sister. Bingley had now been gone a week, and nothing more was heard of his return. Jane was in a great distress of Mr. Bingley's continued absence. Jane was in a great distress of Mr. Bingley's continued absence. Day after day passed away without bringing any news of him. Even Elizabeth began to fear that his sisters would be successful in keeping him away. The united efforts of his two unfeeling sisters and of his overpowering friend, assisted by the attractions of Miss Darcy and the amusements of London, might be too much, she feared, for the strength of his attachment. Chapter 24. Miss Bingley's letter arrived, and put an end to doubt. The very first sentence said that all settled in London for the winter, and concluded that her brother was regretting because he did not have time to pay his respects to his friends in Hertfordshire before he left the country. Hope was over, entirely over. Miss Darcy's praise occupied the main part of the letter. Elizabeth's heart was divided between concern for her sister and resentment against all others. To Caroline's assertion of her brother's affection to Miss Darcy she paid no attention. That he was really fond of Jane she doubted no more. A day or two passed before Jane had courage to speak of her feelings to Elizabeth. "Oh, I wish my dear mother had more command over herself. She can have no idea of the pain she gives me by her continual reflections on Mr. Bingley, but I hope it cannot last long. He will be forgotten, and we shall all be as we were before." Elizabeth looked at her sister with incredulous solicitude, but said nothing. "You do not believe me," cried Jane, slightly colouring. "Indeed, you have no reason. He may live in my memory as the most amiable man of my acquaintance, but that is all. Thank God, I have not that pain." "My dear Jane," exclaimed Elizabeth, "you are too good. Your sweetness and disinterestedness are really angelic. I do not know what to say to you. His sisters influence him." "I cannot believe it," replied Jane. "Why should they try to influence him? They can only wish his happiness. And if he is attached to me, no other woman can secure it. Beyond a doubt, they do wish him to choose Miss Darcy. If they believed him attached to me, they would not try to part us. If he were so, they could not succeed. Let me take everything in the best light, in the light in which it may be understood." From this time Mr. Bingley's name was scarcely ever mentioned between them. Mrs. Bennet still continued to wonder. Elizabeth tried to convince her of what she did not believe herself, that his attentions to Jane had been merely the effect of common and transient liking. Mrs. Bennet's best comfort was that Mr. Bingley must come again in the summer. Mr. Wickham's society dispelled the gloom of the Longbourn family. They saw him often, and to his other recommendations was now added that of general unreserve. What Elizabeth had already heard, his claims on Mr. Darcy, and all that he had suffered from him, was now openly acknowledged, and everybody was pleased to know how much they had always disliked Mr. Darcy before they had known anything. Miss Bennet was the only person who could admit there might be any excuse for Mr. Darcy unknown to the society of Hertfordshire, but by everybody else Mr. Darcy was condemned as the worst of men. Chapter 25. On the following Monday, Mrs. Bennet had the pleasure of receiving her brother and his wife, who came as usual to spend the Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man. Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet, was an amiable, intelligent, elegant woman, and a great favourite with all her Longbourn nieces. The two eldest had frequently been staying with her in town. Mrs. Bennet had many grievances to relate, and much to complain of. Two of her girls had been upon the point of marriage, and after all there was nothing in it. I do not blame Jane, she continued, but Lizzie, oh sister, it is very hard to think that she might have been Mr. Collins's wife by this time. Just think, Lady Lucas will have a daughter married before I have. The Lucases are very artful people indeed, sister. It makes me very nervous and poorly to be thwarted so in my own family, and to have neighbors to think of themselves before anybody else. Mrs. Gardiner, to whom this news had been given before in the course of Jane and Elizabeth's correspondence with her, made her sister a slight answer, and, in compassion to her nieces, turned the conversation. When alone with Elizabeth afterwards, she spoke more on the subject. These things happen so often. A young man, such as you describe Mr. Bingley, so easily falls in love with a pretty girl for a few weeks, and when accident separates them, so easily forgets her. Say, how violent was Mr. Bingley's love! I never saw a more promising inclination. Every time they meet, it was more decided and remarkable. At his own ball he offended two or three young ladies by not asking them to dance, and I spoke to him twice myself without receiving an answer. Oh yes, poor Jane, I am sorry for her. But do you think she would join us to go back with us? Changes may help her, and perhaps a little relief from home may be useful. Elizabeth was exceedingly pleased with this proposal. I hope, added Mrs. Gardiner, that she will not connect this journey with this young. We live in a different part of town. All our connections are so different, and, as you well know, we go out so little, that it is very improbable that they should meet at all, unless he really comes to see her, and that is quite impossible. Mr. Darcy would not let him go alone. My dear aunt, how could you think of it? Mr. Bingley never moves without him. I hope they will not meet at all. Miss Bennet accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure. Chapter 26. Mrs. Gardiner decided to talk to Elizabeth about Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth, are you in love with him? Oh, do not be afraid. He shall not be in love with me if I can prevent it. Elizabeth, you are not serious now. I beg your pardon. At present I am not in love with Mr. Wickham. No, I certainly am not. But he is, beyond all comparison, the most disagreeable man I ever saw. And if he becomes really attached to me, I believe it will be better that he could not. Oh, that abominable Mr. Darcy! My father, however, is partial to Mr. Wickham. In short, my dear aunt, all that I can promise you, therefore, is not to be in a hurry. In short, I will do my best. Charlotte and Mr. Collins got married. The wedding took place, and the bridge room went to Kent from the church door. Elizabeth soon heard from her friend, and their correspondence was as regular as frequent as it had ever been. Elizabeth felt that Charlotte wrote cheerfully, seemed surrounded with comforts. The house, furniture, neighborhood, and roads were all to her taste, and Lady Catherine's behavior was most friendly. Chapter 27. January and February passed away. In March, Elizabeth decided to visit Hunsford. She had not at first thought very seriously of going there, but Charlotte insisted. Abscess had increased her desire of seeing Charlotte again, and weakened her disgust of Mr. Collins. Moreover, the journey would give her an opportunity to see Jane. The farewell between herself and Mr. Wickham was perfectly friendly. She left him convinced that, Whether married or single, he must always be her model of the amiable and pleasing. It was a journey of only 24 miles, and they began it so early as to be in Gracechurch Street by noon. As they drove to Mr. Gardiner's door, Jane was at a drawing-room window watching their arrival. Elizabeth was pleased to see her faithful and lovely as ever. The day passed most pleasantly away, the morning in shopping and the evening at one of the theatres. Elizabeth received an invitation to accompany her uncle and aunt in a tour which they proposed taking in the summer. "We have not determined how far it shall carry us," said Mrs. Gardiner, "but perhaps to the Lakes." No plan could have been more agreeable to Elizabeth, and her acceptance of the invitation was most ready and grateful. "Oh, my dear, dear aunt!" she rapturously cried, "what delight, what felicity! You give me fresh life and vigor. Goodbye to disappointment and spleen. What are young men to rocks and mountains? Oh, what happy hours we shall spend! Lakes, mountains, and rivers, I adore them." Chapter 28. Elizabeth's northern tour was a constant source of delight. When they left the high road for the lane to Hunsford, every eye was in search of the personage. Finally the personage was seen. Mr. Collins and Charlotte appeared at the door, and the carriage stopped at the small gate. Mrs. Collins welcomed her friend with the liveliest pleasure, and Elizabeth was more and more satisfied with coming when she found herself so affectionately received. She saw instantly that her cousin's manners were not altered by his marriage. Elizabeth was prepared to see him in his glory. He wished to make her feel what she had lost in refusing him. When Mr. Collins said anything of which his wife might be ashamed, which certainly was very often, she involuntarily turned her eye on Charlotte. Once or twice she could discern a faint blush, but in general Charlotte wisely did not hear. Mr. Collins invited his guests to take a walk in the garden, which was very large. To work in this garden was one of the most respectable pleasures. His house was a handsome modern building, well situated on rising ground. From the garden Mr. Collins would have led them round his two meadows, but the ladies, not having comfortable shoes, not turned back, and while Sir William accompanied him, Charlotte took her sister and friend over the house to have the opportunity of showing it without her husband's help. It was rather small, but well built and convenient, and everything was fitted up and arranged with a neatness and consistency. She had already learnt that Lady Catherine was still in the country. They spoken about her while they were at dinner, when Mr. Collins observed, "Yes, Miss Elizabeth, you will have the honour of seeing Lady Catherine de Bourgh on Sunday at church, and I need not say you will be delighted with her. We dine at Rosings twice every week, and are never allowed to walk home. Her ladyship's carriage is regularly ordered for us. I should say one of her ladyship's is carriages, for she has several. Lady Catherine is a very respectable, sensible woman indeed," added Charlotte, "and a most attentive neighbour." "Very true, my dear, that is exactly what I say." About the middle of the next day, as she was in her room getting ready for a walk, Elizabeth heard somebody running upstairs in a violent hurry, and calling loudly after her. She opened the door and met Maria, who, breathless with agitation, cried out, "Oh, my dear Eliza, make haste and come into the dining room. I will not tell you what it is. Make haste and come down this moment." Elizabeth asked questions in vain. Maria would tell her nothing more, and down they ran into the dining room. It was two ladies stopping in a low phaeton at the garden gate. "And is this all?" cried Elizabeth. "I expected at least that the pigs were got into the garden, and here is nothing but Lady Catherine and her daughter." "My dear," said Maria, quite shocked at the mistake. "It is not Lady Catherine. The old lady is Mr. Jenkinson, who lives with them. The other is Miss de Bourgh. Only look at her. She is quite a little creature. Who would have thought that she could be so thin and small? Why does she not come in? Oh, Charlotte says she hardly ever does. It is the greatest of favours when Miss de Bourgh comes in." "I like her appearance," said Elizabeth. "She looks sickly and cross. Yes, she will make him a very proper wife." There was nothing more to be said. The ladies drove on, and the others returned into the house. Chapter 29. Mr. Collins's triumph in consequence of this invitation was complete. The power of showing the grandeur of his patronage to his visitors was exactly what he had wished for. Scarcely anything was talked of the whole day or next morning but their visit to Rosings. Mr. Collins was carefully instructing them in what they were to expect. The sight of such rooms, so many servants, and so splendid a dinner. He said to Elizabeth, "Do not make yourself uneasy, my dear cousin, about your dress. Lady Catherine will not think the worse of you for being simply dressed." As the weather was fine, they had a pleasant walk of about half a mile across the park. Every park was its beauty, and Elizabeth saw much to be pleased with. From the entrance hall they followed the servants to the room where Lady Catherine, her daughter, and Mrs. Jenkinson were sitting. Her ladyship, with great condescension, arose to receive them. Elizabeth could see three ladies before her. Lady Catherine was a tall, large woman with strongly marked features which might once have been handsome. When, after examining her mother, in whose countenance she soon found some resemblance of Mr. Darcy, she turned her eyes on the daughter. She was very thin and small. There was neither in figure or face any likeness between the ladies. Miss de Bourgh was pale and sickly. Her features were insignificant, and she spoke very little. The party did not supply much conversation. Elizabeth was ready to speak whenever there was an opening, but she was seated between Charlotte and Miss de Bourgh, the former of whom was engaged in listening to Lady Catherine. Mrs. Jenkinson was chiefly employed in watching how little Miss de Bourgh ate, pressing her to try some other dish. The gentlemen did nothing but eat and admire. When the ladies turned to the drawing room, there was little to be done but to hear Lady Catherine talk. "Do you play and sing, Miss Bennet?" "A little." "Oh, then, some time or other we shall be happy to hear you. Our instrument is a capital one. You shall try it some day. Do your sisters play and sing?" "One of them does." "Why did not you all learn? Do you draw?" "No, not at all." "What, none of you?" "Not one." "That is very strange. But I suppose you had no opportunity." "We never had any governess." "No governess? How was that possible?" "Five daughters brought up at home without a governess. I never heard of such a thing. Then who taught you? Who attended to you?" "We were always encouraged to read, and had all the masters that were necessary. Those who chose to be idle certainly might." When the gentlemen had joined them, and tea was over, the card tables were placed. Lady Catherine, Sir William, and Mr. and Mrs. Collins sat down to quadrille. Chapter 30. Sir William stayed awake at Hunsford. The room in which the ladies sat was backwards. From the drawing room they could distinguish nothing in the lane. Very few days passed in which Mr. Collins did not walk to Rosings. Elizabeth's son soon perceived that though the great lady was not in commission of the peace of the country, she was a most active magistrate in her own parish. The entertainment of dining at Rosings was repeated about twice a week, and allowing for the loss of Sir William, and there being only one card table in the evening, every such entertainment was the counterpart of the first. This, however, was no evil to Elizabeth, and upon the whole she spent her time comfortably enough. There were half hours of pleasant conversation with Charlotte, and the weather was so fine for the time of year that she had often great enjoyment out of doors. In this quiet way the first fortnight of her visit soon passed away. Easter was approaching. Elizabeth had heard soon after her arrival that Mr. Darcy was expected there in the course of a few weeks. Lady Catherine talked of his coming with the greatest satisfaction, spoke of him in terms of the highest admiration. His arrival was soon known at the parsonage. On the following morning Mr. Collins hastened to Rosings to pay his respects. There were two nephews of Lady Catherine to require them, for Mr. Darcy had brought with him a Colonel Fitzwilliam. Charlotte had seen them from her husband's room crossing the road. Colonel Fitzwilliam was about 30, not handsome, but in person and address most truly the gentleman. Mr. Darcy looked just as he had been used to look in Hertfordshire, with his usual reserve. Elizabeth, after a moment's pause, said, "My eldest sister has been in town 3 months. Have you seen her there?" She knew perfectly that Mr. Darcy never had, and she thought he looked a little confused as he answered that he had not met Miss Bennet. The subject was pursued no farther, and the gentlemen soon afterwards went away.